Hey all, thought we'd get together and talk about our 3D models, and the important parts about it are textures, materials, and shaders. What are those three things specifically? So we're going to break into that a little bit, and then we're going to break into how we use all of those, and then eventually into shader graph inside of Unity in a separate video. So let's just talk about textures, materials, and shaders. All right, to start off, let's take a look at our 3D decals here that we've got set up. Let's take a look at, let me grab them here. Let me take a look and rotate them around here. You'll see that we're getting some shininess and some splatter effect going across the surface here. We've got some color for emissive mapping. We've got some texture color also inside of here. And if we look at the material editor real quick, let's just take a look at it. Right now, all it's using is a bitmap for the color map, a bitmap for the roughness map, and a bitmap for the metal map, a bitmap for the emission, and then a bitmap for the bump, and finally a bitmap for the opacity. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But this is an RGB texture, meaning that it uses all four colors. Let's take a look at these textures inside of Photoshop, just so you get an idea of what they look like. So we'll open up Photoshop real quick, and I have them all set up for us. All right, let's look at them inside of Photoshop here. So we've got our decal trim sheet base map, and that's the texture that we're using underneath the main picture. So it's the actual picture. If I had colors in here, it would use those colors. And to show you what I mean, if I say B, I take a color, brain here, and I just do this, and I say save, and bam, real quick. All right, and then come back over to Max. You'll see now everything I've drawn is across that surface. So it does deal with color, okay? So let's go back into Photoshop. So that's our color map, even if it's a black and white in this case. It does use color, just, again, we're just using it for black and white. This next one over is a mask map, and we'll come back to that. This is specifically used for Unity, and we'll talk how it's used in a minute. Then we have our normal map, which we've seen before, and then we have our emissive map, which is just black and color. And this could be black and white, but if we use color, we can have separate colors across the surface easier. And then I've broken it down into AO, which is ambient occlusion, and decal trim metal, which is the metal map, and then decal trim opacity, and then I thought I had the decal trim smoothness, but it looks like it's disappeared on me, so I'll just throw it in here too. And let's do this. We'll say window arrange and just do all window like this. Zoom out. And it may be good to note that everything, these three colors, and then of course this one, if we move this over here, are the only ones that are full color. If we look at this, but it's a black and white map. It's really no other information than black and white. And that's the smoothness. Here is the metal in the order that they're in there. We aren't using AO. Okay, so AO we'll talk about in a few minutes. But what we're using in Max is the diffuse color, we're using the emissive color, we're using the smoothness, and we're using the metal. If you come back over to Max, you'll see here are those textures. The only other thing that we're using in Max is this cutout opacity. And what that is it's using a bitmap. What it's doing is using this target type, this base map texture, which over here. But inside of this, it's using the channels and it's using the alpha to do the cutout. So if we look back at Max, it's cutting it out. And why am I showing you all this? Well, there's really point to it. That I want you to understand that all these maps have their special purposes and their needs, but this right here is the key to making it work on 3D objects in Max. And just like this, inside of Unity, there's one of those too. But I want to break these down a little bit more so you can break down these maps and understand what you're looking at and understand maybe why we have extras in our case. So, like this won't work really well inside of Max because I can't really do what I need to do. So what is this map? Why is this map here? What is it doing? If we look at it and we go over to the actual channels, you'll see that the red channel looks an awful lot like our metal map because it's exactly the same. Okay, and if we look at our green channel, it looks an awful lot like our AO, which because it's exactly the same. It may be a little lighter for some reason, but it is the same. And then if we look at our alpha map, we'll see that it's exactly the same as our smoothness map because they are the same. That's what this map is. It's smoothness in the alpha channel, red is the metal, and green is the AO, or the ambient occlusion. We don't use the blue is for detail at a later time. So this map is all compressed for 3 to 4 maps, right? That's great. It's great for an engine, but it doesn't actually work in Max this way because it's not broken up. But you'll notice this is a trend here. We keep going back to the alphas, or we keep going back to the channels, the RGB channels. We learned a long time ago that RGB channels, and in fact, I just noticed that my normal map is hidden somewhere too, so our normal map is where we kind of started doing this. If we look at our normal map, we've talked about this before, but a normal map is the information for XYZ. It's a transfer from RGB color to XYZ for the computer to calculate normals. And there's a lot more to it, but that's the general gist. And if we look at our RGB channels right here in this normal map, we don't have an alpha, so it's just these 3 channels. This is the X, this is the Y, up and down, and this is the Z, forward and back. So when a computer, when our program, our engine looks at this, it's able to tell the object what is 3D by making it feel more pushed out or pulled in or whatever it needs to do. Since we started doing this, then we realized we could do the same thing with things like this, and there's other maps we do it too, because these are all just black and white gray maps. If we look at them, they're indexed to gray, gray, gray. There's one layer on all of them. This one has these 3 colors. Even though it's not using them, they could be used, and then we use our alpha. So it's important to understand that we're trying to get as many of these type of maps together and then compress them down into as many smaller versions of them or less versions of them, so the computer has less things to put together. And then we come back into Max and we look at this, and we've now got these maps all defined out. Now this one, you'll notice the difference between this one, which is the same map, and this one is this box is checked for mono-channel outputs. We want to make sure that it looks at the alpha for this, because this is the material, or this is part of the material that makes it go transparent. Okay, so let's talk about what these maps are doing. Okay, so let's take a look at what this map does. And these are the key right here, because we've done it in the last version, last stuff we talked about, we mapped this to channel 2, right? So that was another thing, these weren't mapped correctly. When I get it, that's a part of the problem. Okay, so if we look at this, and we do see this, let's see what we're actually getting. This is the smooth roughness. If I take this off, and what I've done in this, as you can see here, is I've added a roughness value of 75, because that's close to the same strength that this is, and I'll show you what happens if I take it off. But let me take off this map. Suddenly I'm not getting those hot spots or anything, and those scratched up spots. I'm getting some of them, but I'm not getting the same kind of values. And I'll go put it back on. You can see how much beat up that looks. And a lot of people just use the roughness map, okay? But if I churn this actually down to 0, then I get something super shiny. That's not what we want. So we'll put this back on. All right, so we see what that one does. It does these highlighted. It really makes it shiny in certain areas, and that's because it's a black and white map, and it's got those, you know, simple changes, and you can tell it's more gray than it is white, because if it's white, it gets too shiny. And we'll look at this metal map, and we'll take it off, move it around, and basically we've lost some more of that. It's a little bit less dark. It doesn't shine nearly as much when we look at the smooth rough anymore. So we'll put this back up here. And now we're getting little speckles. So some of these only work when you put both of them together. So that gray map is saying this is where it's shiny and this is where it's dark. So that's what that material does for it, and that's why we have 2 maps. And then of course the colors are fine too, and then I messed up this, but that's fine. So that's what they do. Now, why am I talking about this again? Because then we're going to talk about a material. What is a material? A material is basically like a container that holds all the specific information that you want to use on the object. It breaks it down to different parts, and whether you need all these parts or not, they're here for you to use. That's what a material is, and it doesn't matter if you're in Max or in Unity or wherever. The next thing over after that you hear people talk about is shaders. Well, shader is what controls is the container of what this material is made out of. Basically, you're saying, I want a base color, I want a roughness map, I want a middle map, I want all these things, and then all the settings for each one of these is written inside the shader. It's the code behind the material. That the material is a container that holds all your textures and all the cool things they do. The shader is the backbone of what they made that container out of. So that's what those three things are for. And what we're going to get into is building a shader. And I wanted to make sure you completely understood what a material, what a texture, and what a shader is. We'll come back into that and we'll talk about that next. Or we'll talk about Unity shaders next.